Hello everyone. In today's class I want to talk about the emergence, or today's lecture, talk about the emergence of the Fifth Republic. If you remember, after the Second World War, France declared a Fourth Republic in response to the collapse of the Third Republic in 1940. And in this class we're going to see how the Fourth Republic actually ends up being relatively short-lived. So by the early 1950s, the kind of promise that liberation had brought of a new dawn in French politics had somewhat faded. French politics had become very kind of conservative, lacked a lot of kind of direction in terms of where the French state was actually going. And so the flame I have here, the idea is that the hope of liberation was kind of extinguished by the early 1950s. Just to give you a quote here, so Henri Couillet was Prime Minister 3 different times between 1948 and 1951. And one of his most famous quotes is, "Success in politics depended not on solving problems, but on shutting up those who posed them." And I think that quote kind of best reflects the fact that not much had changed since the Third Republic, that the institutions of the Fourth Republic were very similar to those of the Third Republic, and the same problems essentially were being created, where there was a lack of real direct central leadership direction to the French economy and the French state in general, and little actually being achieved. Under Couillet and his successor Antoine Panay, the French government was pretty conservative. It mostly was concerned with cutting budget costs to deal with the chronic problem of inflation, which still afflicted the French economy. But it made very little real efforts to invest in the French economy itself, to modernize it, to try and make it more competitive in the global market. So France was still relatively economically stagnant in the early 1950s. And it also faced an enormous crisis of confidence based on foreign policy issues, or more specifically, issues of empire. If you remember in our last lecture, we talked about how Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh had rebelled against the French after 1945, had refused to accept French efforts to reconquer the country and force Vietnam to join the French Union, or at least North Vietnam to join the French Union. That war continued, and it came to a disastrous end from the French point of view in 1954. The French military, here's the Jeopardy question to prepare you for the answer. The French army was decisively defeated by the Viet Minh here in 1954. So this is an important battle in world history. What is Dien Bien Phu? So Dien Bien Phu, you see in the map here, as my mouse can come over, do you see? I guess it can. Dien Bien Phu is in the extreme west of North Vietnam. Basically, the French were tired of the kind of guerrilla warfare tactics being employed by the Viet Minh, and they hoped that if they could lead the Viet Minh into an open conflict, their superior technology, their superior familiarity with more open warfare, more traditional warfare, would allow them to defeat the Viet Minh. So the French basically set up a camp on a large hill at Dien Bien Phu, out in the open, in the heartland of Viet Minh territory. They believed that if the Viet Minh wanted to attack it, they would have to, engage in more formal, open style of warfare. And they believed that the Viet Minh simply would be unable to do this. What they didn't realize was the Viet Minh had been supplied heavy artillery pieces by the Chinese government. And they were simply able to surround Dien Bien Phu and begin shelling it, which is what the French had not expected. And quite quickly, the battle turned very ugly for the French. The idea was, if you go back to this clip here, you see these airplanes. The idea was that Dien Bien Phu would be supplied by the air by the French, so that their soldiers would have continual source of supply. But they were cut off actually from the rest, or from their air supply, by Vietnamese artillery pieces and anti-aircraft weapons. And after a few months, they were forced to surrender. And this is a picture of the Viet Minh capturing the French fortress, or the French base at Dien Bien Phu. So this was a humiliating defeat for the French government. It provoked a crisis in the Fourth Republic, a real kind of shock to, whatever about the humiliation of the Second World War, for the French army to be so comprehensively defeated by the people they considered to be their inferiors, frankly, was particularly galling for the French. And in order to try and find a solution to the kind of stagnation of the government of the Fourth Republic, the French Parliament turned to this guy here, so Pierre Mendès France. he had been a member of the French resistance during the Second World War. He was of Jewish descent. He was quite critical of the government after 1945, insisted that it was too focused on balancing the budget, not doing enough to invest in the French economy, to modernize the French economy, and felt that there was a real lack of leadership in the government itself. So in 1954, Pierre Mendès France promised that if he was made Prime Minister, he would resolve the whole issue with Vietnam within 30 days. And so he was appointed Prime Minister. And so this Swiss city where Jean Calvin once governed hosts the highest number of international organizations in the world. And the answer is Geneva. And so basically, Mendès France managed to arrange a peace conference with the Vietnamese in Geneva in 1954. So shortly after the defeat of Dien Bien Phu, the conference is held in Geneva. And, true to his word, Mendès France is able to find a solution. What he basically agreed to is that Vietnam will be divided in two. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north, the communist state under Ho Chi Minh, would be fully independent. And in the south, there would also be a new independent state of Vietnam, a democratic government, of the responsibility for which, of protection for which, would be in the hands of the United States. And the idea was that in a few years in the future, a referendum would be held on whether the two states would be united. So essentially, Vietnam was no longer the French problem, it became an American problem, and as I'm sure you're aware, was to remain a significant American problem for the next 2 decades. And the French had washed their hands of Vietnam. So Pierre Mendès France had shown that with decisive leadership, some of these kind of long-running, nagging problems could be quickly resolved. Along the same lines, he decided to give political autonomy to the French colony of Tunisia in North Africa, solving another issue. And he also finally took the bull by the horns in relation to the European defence community. If you remember, this was a proposal for all the nations of Western Europe to provide soldiers for a supranational European army to act as a defence mechanism against Soviet intrusion in Western Europe. It was particularly controversial because a lot of French people felt it was giving up, for two reasons. One, that it would allow for German rearmament, and two, that France would lose some of independence over its own soldiers. Pierre Mendès France finally decided to simply put the proposals on the European Defence Committee to a vote in the National Assembly. It was defeated, but in that sense, Mendès France had lanced the ball, that this had been kind of an issue that had been troubling the French government for the previous couple of years. And once it was defeated, he then began negotiations with other European allies to permit a situation in which Germany would rearm and then participate in NATO, so kind of thereby bypassing the need for the EDC in the first place. He was also notable for his efforts to try and speak directly to the French people. He kind of copied Franklin D. Roosevelt's old tactic of the old fireside chats on the radio. He made significant use of radio to communicate directly with the French people. And he was also not afraid to criticize certain aspects of French society. He felt that France in some ways was too conservative, was not prepared for the modern world as it should be. Very controversially, he raised questions about French alcohol consumption and basically suggested that French people drank too much alcohol, and suggested that they should drink more milk instead, and generally try and live a healthier lifestyle than they had up until this point. That particular comment obviously outraged the French wine industry in particular, but Mendès France was an inspiration for a lot of, especially younger French people, who kind of agreed with him that yet France was stuck in its old kind of ways. It wasn't adapting enough, it wasn't changing to the modern world, and that something kind of a more dramatic new vision of how France could be was required. So Mendès France in some ways comes in and breaks a lot of the log jams that had been stymieing the French Fourth Republic in the mid-1950s, but actually he only remains Prime Minister for 7 months. Once he has solved the crises around Indochina, the crises around the European defence community, normal politics kind of resumes in the Fourth Republic, and he's actually voted out of office after only 7 months in early 1955. He's replaced by Edgar Faure, who's Prime Minister for the next year or so in his wake. And Faure kind of in some ways tries to continue Mendès France's policies of trying to promote modernization of the French economy, modernization of French agriculture, and also continues the policies regarding decolonization. In fact, under Faure, France grants independence to both Morocco and Tunisia. And there's kind of a growing awareness in France that the old colonial empire, that it's kind of served its purpose, maybe it's no longer fit for purpose, and that more and more French people are kind of becoming more accepting of the fact that most of these colonies should be decolonized. So we have Morocco and Tunisia decolonized here. Of course, the controversial one is going to be Algeria, which we'll see later on. Algeria, of course, is not considered a French colony. Even Pierre Mendès France himself is adamant Algeria is France. It is not a colony. Europeans were also able to, the French were also turning away from their empire, the French Union, to place greater emphasis on working more closely with their European allies. If you remember, we talked about in 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was created between these 6 nations of Western Europe. That relationship was further solidified under Faure's premiership with the creation of the European Community in 1957, which essentially, so by the Treaty of Rome, created the European Community, or at least laid the groundwork for the European Community, which was essentially to be an area of a free trade area involving no protective barriers or economic barriers between the countries of Western Europe, with France obviously being a leading player. So France is turning away from empire. France is focusing more on European integration, but the efforts of Mendès to kind of provide stable leadership for the Fourth Republic were very successful during its duration. They were quickly. It was fine that we find that the institutions slip back into their old patterns of not really doing an awful lot, and that is going to become a problem when a crisis emerges in relation to Algeria in the late 1950s.